Hello and welcome everybody once again to a nice Suidlanders chat program between me, Marius Greyling, and Simon Roche, where we casually chat about some of the things that's going on in the world. Simon is back from Russia at his home. Nice to see you back on South African soil, Simon.
Yeah, it's nice to be back. As I've made clear, on many occasions, the Russian experience was absolutely terrific. It was so educational and so very pleasant. The hospitality was the best I've ever received. And that's not an insult to the many Americans who've treated me like a king in their own houses for weeks on end over many years. Everything about it was fantastic, but it was tiring. I said to Mr. Miller, I don't know whether it's because I've gotten older or, what is the reason, but I haven't been so tired after 3 months, almost 3 months of touring since, well, I've never been.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to be here. I walked in yesterday and I had an odd experience, as I was walking over the floorboards. I got this sort of I don't know, peculiar feeling of just being in the right place at the right moment. And I'm not a particularly intuitive person. I don't get wonderful feelings and visions and dreams and forebodings and all of that kind of thing. But there was a tremendous feeling, and my geese are well. My lone duck, whose girlfriends, whose wives were all eaten up by the otters in the mountains, who I sort of rescued in that sense that I brought him down here, is doing well. My dog was pleased to see me. My kitty cat refused to come out for a day, like 24 hours kind of. And then eventually, just before lunch this morning, she came out and she was affectionate and happy, and so it's all good, Maurice. It's good to be
Yeah.
home.
Fantastic. Yeah, off air, me and you had a bit of a chat about what our chat will be tonight. And I think the headlines all across the world basically is about the silliness of the USA and what they are doing around the world, antagonizing, I mean, Russia and all, yeah, just the moves that they are making. Everybody is biting their nails, like Scott Ritter and George Galloway and those guys are like they can't believe the things that he is doing.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I've been trying to explain to people for years. An Afrikaans guy used an expression about this. We were chatting about 7 or 8 years ago. And he said in Afrikaans, you don't get into that position unless you are one of them. Jy kom nie in daai posisie nie tensy jy een van hulle is nie. Uh and I've tried to help people to understand that although Donald Trump sells himself a certain way, that doesn't mean that that's who he is. And I've often used the example of it's a terrible example, but we had a personal close shave experience some years ago, very near, what's the right word? It's more than a drama, a tragedy. And I ended up having to explain to my sons that if a dirty man wants to do something bad to you, he's not going to come running with a what we call a panga in
Mm.
South Africa, which is like a broader machete, and screaming, I'm going to chop you up and eat you, and your mommy and your daddy are never going to see you again. He's going to talk nicely to you and he's going to offer you an ice cream. And likewise, in American politics, the there's a sale involved, a sale of personality and promises, which is not necessarily reflective of the heart and the soul of the human being concerned. But in American politics, there tends to be, I don't say it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, but I would say it is by far most the case in the USA that the people vote for the sell. They vote for the deep fried chips, for the sugar, for the confectionery, for the last thing that the person said, whether it's Hillary Clinton spouting all sorts of liberal stuff or Donald Trump talking conservative stuff. And one thing that has happened over the period since his election that illustrates this point the most is how he has acted against LGBTQ while appointing as his Treasury Secretary a man married to a man. So it's a big bull dust story. And now to answer you directly, or to respond directly to you, now we're seeing what this guy is really willing to do at the behest of those people who put him where he is. Bombing Iran, it's unbelievable, absolutely incredible. Using negotiations as a red herring, as a distraction, to get them to let down their guard so that they could be more vulnerable. Low stuff by the standards of international diplomacy. And now you have, as you mentioned off air, a scenario where the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, tweets something and he trolls Donald Trump so hard that Donald Trump, as one channel put it, rage deploys. He rage deployed nuclear missile submarines.
Yeah.
It's lunacy. And at the same time, you had him over a very similar period. You had him deploy gravity bombs, nuclear bombs, to the UK, to the British Isles, for the first time since 2008. And you had the US commander of the US forces in Europe. There's a huge US military presence in Europe, saying that Kaliningrad could be taken, and it would be taken in a speed never before seen. Or, in fact, that's not what he said. What he said was that the air defense could be absolutely broken, presumably with ideas of occupation. General Christopher Donahue, the head of US European Command, it's absolute flipping insanity breaking loose before our very eyes.
Yeah.
And as if that wasn't enough, you had another US senior military commander, a lieutenant colonel, writing in an authoritative defense industry or defense world, let's say, journal, that it's time for the US to buy back the Commander Islands. Kaliningrad is the former, or a former, capital of Prussia. Prussia was Eastern Germany. Prussia was the traditional home of the German military class. And Germany only became a state very late in the 19th century, in the 1800s. It was previously a series of principalities. There were even some little units within the borders of modern day Germany, that's to say little states effectively, that were church states. They were owned by a local cathedral. They had their own money, they had their own laws, they were completely independent. And German unification actually came quite late in the day. And Prussia contributed, once they were joined up. Previously, Prussia was, as I say, independent. It was a different place. It was its own place. Once there was this conjoining of all of these tiny principalities and little states, Prussia was the home and the heartland of German military might. And after World War II, well, let's say during World War II, when the Soviets swept through Eastern Europe, they gobbled up Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Eastern Germany. And they gave much of Eastern Germany to Poland. They said, you keep this, you hang on to this. You're going to be part of the Warsaw Pact from now on. That's the pact between the communist countries of Eastern Europe. So you had the Soviet Union that was made up of 15 republics, roughly speaking. 15 entities that are now modern day republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, the five stans: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Moldova, and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. That was the Soviet Union. And then it broke apart. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet Union plus the Eastern European countries that the Soviet Union gobbled up as it surged westward towards the end of World War II. So it said, well, Poland, since we've conquered you and you're going to become commies like us, we're going to entrust to you a huge chunk of Eastern Germany. Boom. It gave them a donation. And then it said, and East Germany minus Prussia, which has now been donated to Poland, East Germany is going to be communist. We all remember West and East Germany. And then you had stuck away at the top on the Baltic Sea this little enclave that used to be known as Königsberg, that's now called Kaliningrad, that Russia kept, or the Soviet Union, I should say, kept for itself. So the history of it is, we can all have our own opinions. I think it's regrettable that Prussia was destroyed that way. I wish that there wasn't Kaliningrad, but there is, and it's recognized. So from the Russian point of view, there's no conversation about history or what have you. The fact is that the whole world recognizes that this is part of Russia. That is the status quo, as it has been since forever. The USA only stole the Hawaiian Islands from the Seven Kings in the 1800s, late in the 1800s. 24% of the modern USA belong. That 24% of the USA was kind of a salient that went up all the way to Idaho, right to the furthest north of the USA. There's no conversation now about the USA giving the Hawaiian Islands back to the Seven Kings.
Yeah.
There's no conversation now about Mexico getting any of its stolen territory back. So although I have a sentimental sympathy for Prussia as a historical entity that achieved many things, the reality is that in practical modern day politics, Kaliningrad is Russian, end of story. So the degree of provocation of a US general, such a senior commander, saying we can just take it anytime we like, faster than anybody's done anything like that, is tremendous. And then to go back to what we've moved on to, the Commander Islands are two islands in the far west of the Aleutians. There's a chain of islands that links North America and East Asia, Russia. Those islands are known as the Aleutian Islands. It's a long chain. It's very interesting geographically to see how those two huge entities are linked by this chain of islands. When the Tsar sold Alaska, which belonged to Russia, to the USA, the Aleutian Islands were part of the deal, except that Russia kept the two westernmost of that chain of islands, and they're known as the Commander Islands. And the premise was so that we can monitor Russian submarines more effectively. We should buy those islands from Russia. And it's not offensive to you and to me when a guy says something absurd like that. But when the Russians hear a representative of the United States military writing that kind of thing, presumably under the aegis of his senior commanders, presumably under the aegis of the White House, it's a mind-boggling provocation
Yeah.
that these guys are openly talking about snapping up in some sale, like Donald Trump wanting to buy Gaza, two of the most strategic islands in our entire country, because given that they are right, so to speak, off the coast of Russia, and given that the USA owns the rest of the Aleutians, it's a huge insult. So I've sort of gone on at some length there in order to give people a good idea of what we're talking about, not just mention it in passing.
Yeah.
But yeah, provocations left, right, and center, Marius.
Yeah. And what the people might not understand with these islands or moving the submarines closer to the shore is Russia will perceive it as you guys are getting ready to do a preemptive strike on us. And Medvedev answered Trump in another tweet, and he said, "Remember, we still have the dead hand." And I think if you maybe can explain, I think you will do a better job of it explaining the dead hand to the listeners and the viewers that doesn't know what is this dead hand that Medvedev was talking about. And Scott Ritter said, "Listen here, I've been to inspect some of those missile sites, and it is real. This dead hand thing. Some people say it's a myth. Some people say it's not." And he said, "I've seen it with my own eyes. It is a thing. So even if they do try and do a preemptive strike on us, trying to move these submarines and whatever, um, USA will still be destroyed. It is
Yeah,
a matter of fact." But yeah, if you can just quickly give an explanation about the data, I think there's a very few people that actually know about it.
yeah. On ski boats, if you lose control of a ski boat at sea, it could zoom to wherever before it runs out of fuel or until it runs out of fuel. And if it's close inshore, that ski boat could, drive through bathers and, that propeller is a lethal thing.
Yeah,
I know quite a lot about ski boats. You could kill many, young children swimming on Christmas Day if you lose control of your ski boat. So if you fall overboard, you're meant to have a little wristband that connects to a little toggle, if you like, so that if you fall overboard, that thing pulls free and the motor cuts out. Similarly, Russia has a system whereby if there is not active, let's say, supervision, for want of a better word, of their nuclear forces constantly. In other words, let's say that I had to keep my thumb, like the Queen's soldiers standing for 8 hours at a time. What a terrible job, if you ask me. Let's say I was in charge of the Russian nuclear forces, and I had to keep my thumb on a biometric scanner. And the moment that I removed it, the nuclear system would assume that everybody died and it would activate its own self.
yeah,
Kind of the opposite of this analogy that I gave of the ski boat. So if there's not active, control, then it assumes that the Russians have lost the war, but they're going to take everybody else out anyway. That's the dead hand. When the dead hand, I've been killed now, I've been blown up sitting in my seat in a bunker in Moscow controlling. My hand is dead. It falls from the control.
mm,
That doesn't mean that there's no more control. That means that at that moment, that controller, if you like, is activated.
yeah,
Now, I'm sure it's not somebody sitting there with their finger on a biometric scanner, or nobody knows. Absolutely nobody has ever suggested even that they know how the dead hand works. We just know that over decades and decades, from the time of the Soviet Union, all of the spying between Russia and the USA, we do know that they have a dead hand system of some description.
mm,
So he was basically saying, if Donald Trump thinks he's clever, by shifting Ohio-class nuclear missile submarines nearer to Russia in order to presumably perpetrate a first strike. Even so, the USA can't win. There's no way that you can win. Even if you're the winner, you can't win.
Yeah.
And people might say, yes, but what if the USA was to strike all of the Russian nuclear assets at once? It's not possible to do because we know from the Belgorod event of, I think it was August 2022, September perhaps, a certain Russian submarine slipped its moorings and put to sea, and NATO lost sight of it within about an hour, if I remember the story correctly. And there was panic. There was a lot of talk on very, very serious military channels. Guys who have good contacts that have proven to be perfect contacts over time. You've got guys like War Monitor. If War Monitor says that Russia is thinking of doing X, Y, and Z, then you know that in a week's time you're going to read or see that Russia has done X, Y, and Z. So NATO panicked big time about that. So we know, I'm not saying that the Russians are perfect and the Americans are fools and their equipment doesn't work and the Russians are better and the Americans are worse. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the panic that ensued following the disappearance of the Belgorod submarine, where they couldn't track it with the undersea trackers on the sea floor, where they started talking about it being a black hole, is indicative of the fact that Russia would be able to retain a capacity, a nuclear capacity. The USA wouldn't be able to annihilate everything all at once. And there are many more anecdotes. We could go on and on and on and on. We know, for instance, that the North Koreans were able to get hold of nuclear missiles from Russia without it being leaked. So sometimes we're inclined to think that satellite means that the Russians and the Americans, to a lesser extent, the British and the French have got a very, very, very good electronic spying capacity. Know everything that's going on in the world all of the time. But there are ways and means to elude it, to elude that surveillance or evade it. And I've no doubt that the Russians, they've got many, many, many secrets up their sleeves, as they revealed recently with the Oreshnik missile. We all saw that thing of that missile striking the ground, not even having an explosive payload, but simply using kinetic energy to create a fantastic explosion. And it took the whole world by surprise.
Yeah. And then we've got a couple of minutes left, Simon. Just on the last note, I see Trump's deadline is now the 8th of August for the sanctions that will most probably be implemented on all the countries that deals with Russia, especially buying oil from them. And then funny enough that India came out and said, listen here, we don't care. We will still buy Russian oil. And India is normally the country that sits on the fence. They don't normally will speak out like that. And I found it very interesting that India was one of the first countries that said, listen here, we don't care. We will still buy Russian oil.
Yeah, because they're making a killing. The Indian economy is doing very well, thank you very much, due to the fact that Europe is buying oil from India. And India is not an oil producing country. It's buying oil that Russia is selling to India.
Yeah.
So the Indians are saying, whoa, 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 whoa. What are you talking about that we're using Russian oil? You're also using Russian oil that you buy from us. This isn't like, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's like holding a conversation with a 3-year-old. And that's why I say that chaos reigns. There's madness, coming out of the USA like we've never seen in history. The irrationality, the illogic of the thing is just too much for your mind.
Yeah.
The Chinese, too, have said, you can do whatever you like. We're going to continue to buy Russian oil. And the threat, of course, the stick with which the USA is threatening to beat China and India and other countries
Yeah.
is tariffs. At one stage, it was proposed that the tariffs would be 500%. So, in other words, if you, Marius, buy from me, Simon, 10 apples, you would have to pay my dog Judith 50 apples of free apples just because Judith is unhappy that you and I are doing business. It's
Yeah.
it's absolutely absurd, but very harmful. There's a company in Port Elizabeth called Gender Mark, Gendamark,
Okay.
and they produce assembly lines, very high specification assembly lines, where you have scanners and controllers and functioning elements that are working on millionths of a second. It's
Mm.
not everybody that can produce these things. And they sell them all over the world. And they just lost a 750 million rand deal
Sure.
because if the companies in the USA, they didn't say, well, as far as I know, it hasn't been said, with whom they were negotiating. Let's say Ford. Let's say Ford in the USA said, yes, we will take one line from you for our new Ford, whatever, uh, Ford Bullet car that we're manufacturing in Detroit, Michigan. Ford came back to Gendermark after the tariffs were implemented on Friday, saying, look, the price of this assembly line that we were going to buy, or the components, they haven't specified exactly. The price of what we were going to buy from you has gone up by 30%.
Mm.
Now it's cheaper for us to buy a similar product from Brazil, Argentina, Hungary, China, who knows where. You're
Yeah.
no longer competitive in the global market. So that just goes to show you the havoc that is being wreaked by these sanctions on the world. And I fully expect, Marius, that it's going to get worse. I know we don't have much time. I want to mention one thing very succinctly. Right at the moment, there is a lot of talk about a false flag exercise being prepared by British intelligence MI6, military intelligence number 6. And so that's the overseas arm of British intelligence, as opposed to MI5, which is the internal arm of British intelligence, and they look for spies and saboteurs and
Mm.
uh, whatever within Britain, perpetrating a massive sabotage event on the Russian fleet of ships, the Russian ships that are carrying oil to various places around the world. And I just thought I'd mention that quickly, because if we do see something dramatic in the days and weeks to come, yeah, it could cause a hang of a lot of trouble, an enormous provocation,
Yeah.
as we have seen continual provocations. I was telling somebody yesterday who didn't know this. I said, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant of Russia is almost every single day. NATO attempts to create a Chernobyl type nuclear event
Mm.
in Russia.
Sure.
Do not fail to understand how bad this thing is.
Yeah.
So they're not getting it right to provoke Russia. So they apparently are about to perpetrate something enormous, Marius.
Yeah. Simon, thanks once again for chatting with me. And then we'll do so Thursday again, I believe. And then we'll look at the other weekly things that's happened across the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Fixed
Great
up, Marius.
Simon. Have a great evening.
Video too.
Cheers, man. Bye.
Bye.